In my previous manuscript, I recounted how one night, whilst tormented by the anxieties of life, I suddenly found myself disembodied, gazing down at myself from what seemed the far side of the universe. This, I came to understand, was no miracle, but a form of telepathic projection, and it was hence, through a long series of adventures, that I learned the art of telepathic communion with other beings across both space and time, extending in ever wider circles until I was joined with the cosmical mind, which spanned the whole of the universe. I have also described how I, as the cosmical spirit, reached out from myself and perceived that which is far greater, the infinite and eternal spirit, the creator of all finite things, the Star Maker. In doing so, I also perceived the Star Maker's vast array of creations, many of them far greater than our own universe, and beyond the comprehension even of an awakened cosmos. In that manuscript, I strove to describe in feeble human words some faint echo of the natures of the Star Maker and his creations. I write this addendum now to describe one more episode from that time. I had not included it in my original draft because I did not then understand it. It was only after considering it in the context of meaning and language that I was able to grasp both its significance and the slightest glimmer of its meaning. For I now believe I witnessed not meaningless images, but a language of the awakened universes themselves. Okay, being serious for a moment, no, I am not Olaf Stapledon. Stapledon was one of the premier science fiction authors in Britain in the 1930s, and his seminal work, the previous manuscript I mentioned, was his novel Star Maker, a fictional history of the entire universe and beyond. Why is that important? Well, it's that time of year again, time for the Cursed Conlang Circus. And following on from my success with Speed Talk last year, I took inspiration from another classic sci-fi story. Only, I may have gone a little crazy this time, because I went bigger. A lot bigger. I am not exaggerating when I say that this could possibly be the biggest language ever envisioned. A language so vast that its name alone would require at least a novel to express, and to express it unambiguously, all the books ever written might not suffice. A language whose merest grammatical particle the whole of the English language is not worthy to parse, but which it is my fate to design. This is Cosmolang, the language of universes. Except, it was a nice idea, but when I started this video, there was one serious problem with it. If the language is so big, how could I possibly translate it? Unironically, just showing a picture of Earth, or even inserting the video clip of Agma Schwa reciting the translation text,
it gnaws its bones as if they were the ribs of time itself,
would be about as faithful a translation as I could make in human terms. But no, I'm better than that. I can do better than just trolling. And after some more thought, I realized there was only one way that I could make an effortful translation of this text into Cosmolang, and that was to translate it in the way Stapledon himself would have done it. And it sounds like this. The site of this episode was contained within the ultimate cosmos. As I have recounted before, the ultimate cosmos is the Star Maker's final creation, a universe far vaster and far subtler than all the others put together. In her, every universe created by the Star Maker, many of them already beyond my comprehension, formed the prototype for a class of subatomic particles, playing roles like the protons and electrons of our universe, and my own life as an atomic cosmos was equally irrelevant in comparison. Faced with this truth, this dread mystery and absolute perfection of the Star Maker, and the infinite subtlety and complexity of his ultimate creation, I was struck down by searing light to blind worship. But as I was struck down, blinded and disoriented, for a fleeting instant I ceased to see the ultimate cosmos rightly as a unified whole. Instead, I saw only the physical units within her, which were universes unto themselves. As I looked closer, struggling to overcome my blindness, my vision was fixed on a single cosmos. This cosmos I perceived was of the same class as myself, that is, as our own universe. It was not, of course, an exact copy. There would be no point to such duplication in the Star Maker's creation, and it differed in small degrees throughout. But its overall structure of awakened galaxies and stars and planets was unmistakably the same. And as I watched this brother cosmos of mine, I saw, most strangely, a series of smaller and simpler universes emanate from it, akin to the earliest creations of the Star Maker. But unlike all the other universes I had seen, these did not take the form of the fundamental particles of the ultimate cosmos. Instead, they existed only as patterns of images imposed upon those particles. As a cloud composed of individual water droplets may form into fanciful shapes, so it was with these emanated universes. In my moment of confusion, distracted by the blinding light of the Star Maker himself, I ignored these visions, believing them to be a hallucination. Even afterwards, I convinced myself that I must have imagined the meaning in them, and it is only recently that I understood my error. And so I recount them here. According to my vision, the first emanation from my brother Cosmos held the image of a universe of the fluid type. It was one of the many classes of universes that were bereft of gravity and filled, as it were, by a kind of water in which solid creatures swam, though to call it such is true only by analogy. The fundamental physical matter in this universe was of its own unique character. It transpired that this fluid cosmos was much smaller than our universe, and was comparable in size to a single planet in relation to its own physical units. I also apprehended that the dominant intelligent species of this cosmos exhibited a social order, though not a physical form, not unlike that of army ants, extending itself in long convoys that maintained a continuous connection with a home base. These would reach out toward centers of power and resources, coiling around them, slowly cutting off escape routes, despite the difficulty of doing so in 3 dimensions. And when their quarry was completely cut off, they would engulf it to carry off their spoils. This mode of operation, though violent by human standards, was well suited to the army ant civilization, and as the dominant race grew stronger in their universe's proper time, it reached the status of an awakened world, united telepathically in purpose. And in this telepathic unity, I sensed, to my surprise, a deep contentment. Here was satisfaction with their lot in life, a pointed lack of a need to reach beyond themselves and explore the potential of infinite space beyond. And despite their apparent exploitative nature, they seemed immune to the cycles of economic crisis and recovery that have so plagued mankind. And in this, I found a kind of tranquil majesty about them. But no sooner had I apprehended this, than my vision was shattered by a telepathic cry of horror from my brother Cosmos, so poignant and so near in spirit that I briefly mistook it for my own. My brother Cosmos had cried out to the Star Maker himself, recoiling from something I could not see, and demanding why the Star Maker would create such a thing. What this thing was I did not understand, but presently I perceived another emanation, simple and produced weakly, as a sob from one overcome with anguish. This emanation was an echo of the Star Maker's earliest and simplest creations containing living creatures, so small that it might equal only a single community, even a small village. As I described in my previous manuscript, these earliest universes were largely of the musical type, which did not contain space or matter as we know it, but structures akin to musical notes and themes. As in several of the musical universes, the internal, proper time of this cosmos was bent into a closed circle so that the final state of the universe led directly into the first. But the way in which this was achieved was a violent one, as each of the creatures sought to control and consume the resources of the others. Yet in doing so, they attacked the very foundations of their own world, until the entire structure of the cosmos collapsed back into primordial noise. The next 2 emanations were alike in sentiment, but more complex and more cogently formed. Both of these carried the image of a later class of the Star Maker's creations, that of a series of linked universes where creatures would live successive lives in each one. These were far nearer to our own cosmos in the sequence of the Star Maker's creations, displaying almost the same maturity of spirit, but they remained strangely small in proportion to their ultimate physical units, again perhaps the size of a single world. At any rate, the next emanation I perceived bore a disturbing twist on this well-trod structure. This cosmos had a structure superficially similar to that of the Hindu cosmology, and others, with 4 successive ages, the first being very prosperous, and each subsequent world being degenerated relative to the previous one. However, this similarity was broken when it came to the reason for this degeneration. It came about that the 4th and poorest of the linked universes was so impoverished that civilization there could barely arise and sustain itself. In their desperation, they reached out telepathically and connected, though they did not recognize it at the time, with their own past selves. And by employing telepathic arts that were only possible in the peculiar physical structure of this cosmos, they were able to siphon resources away from the much richer First World. Thereafter, a brief golden age flourished in the Fourth World, but this degenerated world could not support such prosperity as the First World could, requiring ever more stolen resources to maintain it. I watched in horror as the awakened world became perverted in the same ways that the worst of the awakened worlds in our own cosmos had been perverted, consumed by dominance, fanaticism, and greed. Only too late did they realize that they were stealing from their own past, building the tragedy of their own fall, gnawing the remnants of their squandered birthright in a futile attempt to borrow time for their future. But by the time they understood this, they could not stop the degeneration, and their cosmos collapsed into a final death of entropy and decay. But I had no time to reflect on this horror, for the next emanation came directly after. It was at once a successor to the previous emanation, but also a sort of correction. Its structure was very similar, with successive linked universes siphoning resources from one another. But in this cosmos, the supply of resources was sustained. It did not decay to a final death, but instead the Fourth World circled back to the First, creating a closed loop of time. I initially believed that the flow of resources was also reversed, flowing from future to past, from the end to the beginning, but of course this distinction was meaningless in a circular timeline. After this, I sensed one final emanation from my brother Cosmos before the vision was lost to me. This emanation held the image of a universe that was spatial in character, but most unusual in geometric shape. Though in volume it was similar to a planet, its length in one dimension appeared virtually infinite, while the others curled back on themselves with a quite small circumference. It would be as if mankind lived not on a sphere, but on the surface of an enormous cylinder, no wider than a small asteroid, but long enough to span the solar system. In the proper space-time of this cosmos, a civilization of beings lived on a stretch of the cylinder no longer than the diameter of Earth, which advanced westward at a rate of perhaps a mile or so per year. At the western end, surveying, mining, and building occurred as new lands were colonized and new resources acquired. Meanwhile, the eastern end of the stretch was abandoned at the same rate, its land barren for millennia of use, its graveyards full, its buildings worn down to rubble. So it had continued for years beyond counting. Then, one day, the surveyors returned from the west with strange reports. In what should have been virgin lands, they had discovered fossils of their own kind, estimated to be 100 million years old. In this way, they discovered that their world was not infinite, but was bent into an enormous circle. But this was not the danger to their civilization that it might seem. They found the lands to the west were rich after all, for 100 million years were enough for the land to replenish its resources from the bones of the civilization that came before, and so it seemed they could continue indefinitely. The result of this was a great shift in their culture, as the people knew that from then on they would rely on the resources of the past. This fact became a spiritual axis mundi for their society, and it brought them to a greater awareness and understanding of the cycle of rebirth that formed the foundation of their world. In the moment that I saw them, I did not understand what meaning these visions had or could have, and even as I perceived them, my senses, such as they were, righted themselves, and I beheld the ultimate cosmos in her full glory once again. I again felt the searing light of the Star Maker, and my mind was preoccupied by weightier things. So, I wanted to do this whole video in character, but Stapledon's writing style is so flowery and verbose that there's just not enough time. Maybe I'll do an extended cut later. Anyway, you may be asking right now, how is this embellished restatement of the translation text supposed to be an actual language? Well, confession time, that translation bears about as much relation to Cosmolang as a textbook on acoustics does to Shakespeare. But that's because Cosmolang is so unfathomably complex that this vague series of observations is the only part of it that Stapledon's narrator could reasonably understand and explain to his readers. My own explanation will be equally oversimplified and incomplete, but at least I can get at the linguistics of it. So, first question, what physical form does communication between universes take? From the hints we get in the book, Stapledon probably intended the universes in the ultimate cosmos to communicate telepathically, but that doesn't quite feel right. The few telepathic statements he gives in the book are rendered in plain English, including one as a direct quote. But a cosmical mind spanning an entire universe is not going to be speaking in plain English. Moreover, in the ultimate cosmos, an ordinary universe fills the role of an elementary particle. But it also exists in a medium, and it stands to reason that there can be waves in that medium just like sound waves in air. Of course, ordinary sound waves are not complex enough to reflect the thoughts of universes. But the ultimate cosmos isn't made of waves. It's made of smaller universes. And that gives us a clue to how the phonemes of Cosmolang can work. In quantum physics, famously, particles can have the properties of waves. But less well known is that waves can also have the properties of particles, and they follow exactly the same quantum equations. These are called quasi-particles because they aren't particles, but they still behave like them. But if waves in our universe have the same structure as elementary particles, then waves in the ultimate cosmos should have the same structure as its elementary particles, which are universes. Smaller and simpler universes than the ones speaking the languages, but universes nonetheless. Since they're waves instead of particles, we might call them quasi-universes, but this is misleading. A key point of Star Maker is that every universe has its own equally valid internal reality, nor are these snapshots of universes at a single moment in time. Each one has its own internal time, with its entire history laid out from beginning to end. In this interpretation, not only are the elementary particles of the ultimate cosmos smaller universes, but the fundamental units of all structures are universes. And because they're the fundamental units of structures, they're also the simplest sounds that are possible to exist, and therefore they must be the phonemes of any language spoken there. The next question is, how complex are these phonemes? The very first creation of the Star Maker was a simple waveform, so they can be that simple, but they don't have to be, and they wouldn't be very useful that way. The better question is, how much information content would serve the needs of an awakened cosmos like Stapledon's? Well, how much information content per phoneme do humans need? I estimate a single phoneme has a complexity very roughly similar to a single atom, and the human body contains about 10 to the 28th power atoms. But remember, the phonemes also have to cover time from beginning to end. A human lifespan is very roughly 10 billion times the length of a phoneme, so the whole person is 10 to the 38th power times as complex as one phoneme. That suggests a phoneme in Cosmolang should be about 10 to the 38th times simpler than our universe. How big is that? Well, glossing over a lot of stuff about the best way to calculate it, a good estimate would be about the size of a planet. A phoneme in Cosmolang is as complex as planet Earth, or at least as Earth's biosphere. Every atom of every living thing across all of human history and then some. That's why I considered just showing a picture of Earth as a translation. Luckily, we don't actually have to specify every atom. After all, every nuance of a real phoneme isn't relevant to any human language. Only a few of the most important points are, and everything else is in free variation. That's what we have to work with. Question 3. What is the structure of a phoneme? That is complicated, because there are several moving parts, and those parts are inextricably linked with the grammar of the language. The first thing you need to know is that a phoneme in Cosmolang isn't just a phoneme. It's not even a word. It's much more than that. Each phoneme can contain a narrative as complex as the history of the entire world, the entire lives and histories of every human being who's ever lived. Does Cosmolang contain verbs, for example? According to the great and powerful Agama Shuya, yes it does. But not in the way we usually mean. With all of human history to play with, it would be more accurate to say that a single phoneme in Cosmolang contains every verb, and every noun that it acts on, and so forth. Even on the scale of universes, even if you tie all those nouns and verbs together somehow, each phoneme in Cosmolang must represent at least an entire sentence. In fact, we do need to tie those nouns and verbs together. The external entity that anything we might call a noun refers to will be an entire universe. Something so complex that no single person or thing in our world could possibly describe it. That means each noun must be composed of a whole constellation of characters. For example, a particularly aggressive entity might be represented by the British Empire, the Latin language, Genghis Khan, the invasive kudzu vine, the irrigation projects draining the Aral Sea, and 100 other things, each of them adding its own nuance to the meaning. Likewise, a verb will be a constellation of stories in world history. Large and important stories like the history of colonialism, for example, will be the most important and will contribute the most to its meaning, but 100 other stories from every time and place will add further nuance to it. Also, a phoneme cosmos need not be as limited as our sentences. There may be 100 distinct discourse participants addressed, each one represented by a different constellation of actors. Now, you may be wondering two questions here. First, if a universe can be broken down into all these parts, how can it be considered a single morpheme? It's a phoneme because it's the simplest possible sound you can have in the ultimate cosmos. But how is it a morpheme when you can break it down conceptually into smaller parts? But the answer is, you really can't. Not like we do with human languages. And the reason is tied closely into the second question. If a part of one universe refers to some external entity, how do you refer to that same entity in a different universe that may have completely different laws of physics? The root problem is that a collection of actors that forms a noun in Cosmolang isn't a complete morpheme, precisely because you can't pick it up and plop it down in some other universe. You have to use some new collection of actors local to that universe. But then, how can you even say it's the same noun? The real answer is that it's not the specific elements of the universe that are important, but the structure in which they live. Kudzu or the British Empire or Genghis Khan by themselves are not meaningful. It's their relationship to other nouns or verbs that carry the meaning, and that abstract structure of nouns and verbs together can be copied over to another universe. Although this is going to come up again, so for clarity I'm going to call the specific noun structures and verb structures submorphemes. Real word. So that's how you get from the history of the world to grammatical elements. But this isn't quite the full story, because we're still left with the problem of how to specify all the relevant components of the phoneme out of everything else in the universe, which will be in free variation. And I believe four-dimensional coordinates in space-time are wrong for that. That's how it works in the internal logic of the universe, which is made of atoms and molecules, or the local equivalent, but from an external perspective, the phoneme is still a waveform, and waves are made of harmonics. We can build up an image of Earth using spherical harmonics like this. The lowest frequency, longest wavelength harmonic can only divide the world into two hemispheres. The next harmonics specify smaller features as the continents start to take shape, and they continue adding more and more detail until we see a complete world map. This may seem overly simplistic when I was talking about specifying every atom before, but that's because we're still only looking at the lowest frequency harmonics. Harmonics can run into the hundreds of billions for the 100 billion humans who have ever lived on Earth. Plus, you can have different sets of the same harmonics that correspond to different variables. One set of harmonics might specify the shape of the land, another the distribution of plants and animals, another where to look for natural resources, as many as you want. And the features don't have to be world-spanning either. The right distribution of harmonics will allow you to specify a single point, or 2 points, or any number of points instead of large areas, as in this one-dimensional example. And all those combinations of harmonics together will specify the relevant parts of the phoneme. Next, we need to determine which harmonics are tied to which submorpheme. Interpreting the abstract semantic structure relies on knowing what the submorphemes are, but the harmonics alone don't tell us that. This is where the telepathic communication I mentioned earlier comes back. The mechanism of telepathy is never really explained in the book, but given how it crosses universe boundaries, I suspect that it involves some kind of resonance in the individual minds that make up the cosmical mind. Now, this causes some problems because it suggests that the telepathic messages are not universes in their own right, but are defined by the internal physics of the sender and recipient universes. But ultimately, there's nothing to stop the telepathy from also being defined by harmonics. That's just how math works.
When applied to Cosmolang, the physical harmonics are sort of like a physical or satellite map of the world, while the telepathic component tags relevant features sort of like colors on a political map. But that's just by analogy because these colors have a structure closer to a musical chord.
Every component of a particular submorpheme has a chord that is partially the same to label it, but part of the chord can vary, which is used to apply emotional meaning and context to the utterance by way of how consonant or dissonant it is. The connections between submorphemes, the structures that give them meaning which can be copied onto other phonemes, are the simplest part. Those are the actual object-level relationships between the components of the universe, and thus they can be observed directly. This is more akin to word order than anything else, or perhaps the use of space in sign languages. But it would be as if not only a word's syntax, but part of its meaning depended on its location in a sentence. Now, we're still missing one part of the syntax. Up till now, I've been talking about nouns and verbs, and I've been implying things about adjectives and adverbs with all the things that can add nuances to the phoneme. But I haven't mentioned adpositions and determiners. These are needed because while the internal spatial and temporal relationships in a phoneme can be observed directly, their relation to external entities isn't covered by that and needs to be specified separately. These are handled by low-frequency harmonics that operate on global scales but are less important to the universe's history. If we were to look at Earth's history, this might be something like whether the major landmasses are in the northern or southern hemisphere, or something conceptual like the disproportionate number of beetle species on the planet. Each of these low-frequency harmonics would have a specific meaning connected to the external entities, either relating a submorpheme to a specific entity as a determiner, or relating the external entities to each other as an adposition. And now we've built up a complete grammar. But I have one more confession here. This whole description is still incomplete because there is a second register to the language. This second register is entirely telepathic, and it is the register that is used when Stapledon records any telepathic utterances in the book. As he uses them, they might be said to fill the role of interjections, but in Cosmolang, there's a bit more to them. In Cosmolang, the telepathic register resembles the telepathic map attached to a normal phoneme, but without the root phoneme. The harmonic structures of submorphemes are still there, but not what's in them, nor the relationships between them, so they aren't enough to establish the true meaning. These are then adjusted with additional adpositions and determiners, or even additional mid-range harmonics to fill in the gaps in meaning as needed. The main usage for this is that if the discourse participants have already been established in the conversation, the telepathic map can act as a sort of shorthand to refer back to them. Thus, in addition to interjections, the telepathic register fills the role of pronouns, or more accurately, a pro-phrase. And this truly is the final piece of the puzzle. My translation text earlier is admittedly not the translation itself, but it describes the 6 morphemes that are the real translation, which convey the Ouroboros text in a way that an awakened cosmos would understand. 4 normal phonemes, 1 telepathic utterance, and 1 reduced phoneme, which works in the same way as a normal one, but is smaller and simpler than the others, indicating confusion and emotional distress. You'll kind of have to take my word for it that these morphemes have all the necessary grammatical structure, but the correspondence and meaning should be clear enough, and that's about all that Stapledon's narrator would have been able to comprehend, so that's why the translation came out that way. But I hope I've managed to convey the idea that there is a language in there. And at this point, I'd normally try to translate, like, and subscribe, and thanks for watching into Cosmolang to finish off the video, but I'm already over my word count, so I'll just leave it there.